Currently, Earth. It was April 12th in the year 1633 that the Chief Inquisitor Father Vincenzo Maculani da Firenzuola, appointed by Pope Urban VIII, begins the Inquisition of physicist and astronomer Galileo Galilei. Galileo was ordered to turn himself in to the Holy Office to begin trial for holding the belief that the earth revolves around the sun, which was deemed heretical by the Catholic Church. Standard practice demanded that the accused be imprisoned and secluded during the trial. This was the second time that Galileo was in the hot seat for refusing to accept the Church's orthodoxy that the earth was the immovable center of the universe. In 1616, he had been forbidden from holding or defending his beliefs. In the 1633 interrogation, Galileo denied that he held belief in the Copernican view, but continued to write about the issue and evidence as a means of discussion rather than belief. The Church had decided the idea that the sun moved around the earth was an absolute fact of Scripture that could not be disputed, despite the fact that scientists had known for centuries that the earth was not the center of the universe. This time, Galileo's technical argument didn't win the day. On June 22, 1633, the Church handed down the following order. We pronounce, judge, and declare that you, the said Galileo, have rendered yourself vehemently suspected by this holy office of heresy, that is, of having believed and held the doctrine which is false and contrary to the holy and divine Scriptures, that the sun is the center of the world, and that it does not move from east to west, and that the earth does move, and it is not the center of the world. Along with the order came the following penalty. We order that by a public edict, the book of Dialogues of Galileo Galilei be prohibited, and we condemn thee to the prison of this holy office during our will and pleasure. And as a salutary penance, we enjoin on thee that for the space of 3 years thou shalt recite once a week the 7 penitential psalms. It was April 12th in the year 1961, aboard the spacecraft Vostok 1, that Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Alexeyevich Gagarin becomes the first human being in modern times to travel into space. During the flight, the 27-year-old test pilot and industrial technician also became the first man in modern times to orbit the planet, a feat accomplished by his space capsule in 89 minutes. Vostok 1 orbited Earth at a maximum altitude of 187 miles and was guided entirely by an automatic control system. The only statement attributed to Gagarin during his 1 hour and 48 minutes in space was, quote, "Flight is proceeding normally. I am well," unquote. After his historic feat was announced, the attractive and unassuming Gagarin became an instant worldwide celebrity. He was awarded the Order of Lenin and given the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. Monuments were raised to him across the Soviet Union and streets renamed in his honor. The triumph of the Soviet space program in putting the first man into space was kind of a great blow to our nation, which had scheduled its first space flight for May of 1961. Moreover, Gagarin had orbited Earth, a feat that eluded the U.S. space program until February of 1962, when astronaut John Glenn made 3 orbits in Friendship 7. By that time, the Soviet Union had already made another leap ahead in the space race, with the August 1961 flight of cosmonaut German Titov in the Vostok 2. Titov made 17 orbits and spent more than 25 hours in space. To Soviet propagandists, The Soviet conquest of space was evidence of the supremacy of communism over capitalism. However, to those who worked on the Vostok program and earlier on the Sputnik, which launched the first satellite into space in 1957, the successes were attributable chiefly to the brilliance of one man, Sergei Pavlovich Korolev. Because of his controversial past, chief designer Korolev was unknown in the West and to all but insiders in the USSR until his continuance of eternity in 1966. Born in the Ukraine in 1906, Korolev was part of a scientific team that launched the first Soviet liquid-fueled rocket in 1933. In 1938, his military sponsor fell prey to the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin's purges, and Korolev and his colleagues were also put on trial. Convicted of treason and sabotage, Korolev was sentenced to 10 years in a labor camp. The Soviet authorities came to fear German rocket advances. However, and after only a year, Korolev was put in charge of a prison design bureau in order to continue his rocketry work. In 1945, Korolev was sent to Germany to learn about the V-2 rocket, which had been used to devastating effect by the Nazis against the British. The Americans had captured the rocket's designer, Werner von Braun, who later became head of the U.S. space program. But the Soviets acquired a fair amount of V-2 resources, including rockets, launch facilities, blueprints, and a few German V-2 technicians. By employing this technology and his own considerable engineering talents, by 1954, Korolev had built a rocket that could carry a 5-ton nuclear warhead, and in 1957 launched the first intercontinental ballistic missile. That year, Korolev's plan to launch a satellite into space was approved, and on October 4th in 1957, Sputnik 1 was fired into Earth's orbit. It was the first Soviet victory of the space race, and Korolev, still technically a prisoner, was officially rehabilitated. The Soviet space program under Korolev would go on to numerous space firsts in the late 1950s and the early 60s. First animal in orbit, first large scientific satellite, first man, first woman, first 3 men, first spacewalk, first spacecraft to impact the moon, first to orbit the moon, first to impact Venus, and the first craft to soft land on the moon. Throughout this time, Korolev remained anonymous, known only as the chief designer. His dream of sending cosmonauts to the moon eventually ended in failure, primarily because the Soviet lunar program received just 1/10 of the funding allocated to America's successful Apollo lunar landing program. Korolev continued his eternity in 1966. Upon his continuance, his identity was finally revealed. He was awarded a burial in the Kremlin Wall as a hero of the Soviet Union. Yuri Gagarin continued his eternity in 1968 as a result of a routine jet aircraft test flight. His ashes were also placed in the Kremlin Wall. It was April 3rd in the year 1963 that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., his Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and their partners in the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights led a campaign of protests, marches, and sit-ins against segregation in Birmingham, Alabama. By April 12th, King was in prison along with many of his fellow activists. While in prison, King penned an open letter, now known as his letter from a Birmingham jail, a full-throated defense of the Birmingham protest campaign that is now regarded as one of the greatest texts of the civil rights movement. On April 12th, Good Friday, King and dozens of his fellow protesters were arrested for continuing to demonstrate in the face of an injunction obtained by Commissioner of Safety Theophilus Eugene Bull Connor, Commissioner of Public Safety, excuse me for the misquote. Connor, who had just lost the mayoral election, remains one of the most notorious pro-segregationists in American history, thanks to the brutal methods his forces employed against the Birmingham protesters that summer. The man who had won the election, Albert Boutwell, was also a segregationist, and he was one of many who accused outsiders, he clearly meant King, of stirring up trouble in Birmingham. As he sat in a solitary jail cell without even a mattress to sleep on, King began to pen a response to his critics on some scraps of paper. The resulting letter was addressed to, quote, fellow clergymen, unquote, who had criticized the protest campaign. King first dispensed with the idea that a preacher from Atlanta was too much of an outsider to confront bigotry in Birmingham, saying, quote, I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, unquote. While stressing the importance of nonviolence, he rejected the idea that his movement was acting too fast or too dramatically. Quote, we know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Frankly, I have yet to engage in a direct action campaign that was well-timed in the view of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation, unquote. King also advocated for violating unjust laws and urged that believers in organized religion break loose from the paralyzing chains of conformity. All told, the lengthy letter constituted a defense of nonviolent protests, a call to push the issue of civil rights, and a rallying cry for fence-sitters to join the fight, even if it meant that they, too, might end up in jail. The worst of Connor's brutalities came after the letter was written, but the Birmingham campaign succeeded in drawing national attention to the horrors of segregation. The United Auto Workers paid King's $160,000 bail, and he was released from jail on April 20th. 4 months later, King gave his I Have a Dream speech at the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, regarded by many as the high watermark of his movement. The following year, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which guaranteed voting rights to minorities and outlawed segregation and racial discrimination in all places of public accommodation. The historic information divulged on this audio file can be verified on history.com.